think you know the story of William Wallace. You've seen Braveheart. You've heard the songs of the Scottish hero who defied an empire. You picture a defiant warrior, face painted blue, screaming, "Freedom," as a merciful executioner's blade ends his life. But what if I told you that moment, that iconic scene seared into the minds of a generation, is a sanitized lie? A Hollywood fantasy designed to hide a truth that is infinitely more horrifying. The truth is, there was no quick, clean death for William Wallace. There was no mercy. His final words were not a defiant roar, they were likely choked off by his own screams. What really happened to the man they called the Guardian of Scotland is more brutal than any film would dare to show. It was a calculated, theatrical ritual of torture, a public spectacle of power designed not just to kill a man, but to annihilate a symbol, to crush the very soul of a nation. We're talking about a death that lasted for hours, performed in front of a jeering crowd. A death that involved being hanged until near suffocation, emasculated, disemboweled while still alive, and only then, beheaded and hacked into 4 pieces, his body parts sent across the kingdom as a gruesome warning. This is not the story of a hero's death in battle. This is the story of how an empire tries to erase a legend from history. They wanted to make him a monster, a traitor deserving of oblivion. But they failed. By making his death a spectacle of horror, they unintentionally made him an immortal martyr. Today, we peel back the Hollywood war paint and expose the raw, bloody truth of what really happened to William Wallace. Because to understand his true legacy, we have to confront the terror he was forced to endure. This is dark history, the terrifying truths they never taught you in school. To understand the horror of William Wallace's end, you must first understand the world that created him. Our story begins not in glory, but in crisis. The year is 1286. Scotland, a kingdom that had long prized its fierce independence, is suddenly thrown into chaos. King Alexander III, its strong and respected ruler, rides through a storm to his wife's side, but is thrown from his horse and dies, leaving the throne empty. His only direct heir is a 3-year-old girl, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. A child queen was a fragile hope at best, and for 4 years, the Guardians of Scotland, a council of bishops and noblemen, managed the realm in her name. A marriage was arranged between Margaret and the young son of England's formidable king, Edward I. It seemed a perfect solution, a union of crowns that could bring peace. But fate, as it so often does in these dark tales, had other plans. In 1290, on her voyage to Scotland, the young queen fell ill and died. With her death, the direct line of succession was broken. The dream of peace died with her. This was the moment King Edward I of England had been waiting for. Known as Longshanks for his intimidating height, and the Hammer of the Scots for his ruthless ambition, Edward was a cunning and brutal monarch. He saw Scotland's crisis not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. He declared himself Lord Paramount of Scotland, the ultimate arbiter in the succession dispute that erupted among more than a dozen claimants to the Scottish throne. The 2 main contenders were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the grandfather of the future king, Robert the Bruce. Edward chose John Balliol, believing he would be a weak, pliable puppet king. And for a time, he was right. Edward systematically humiliated Balliol, treating Scotland not as a sister kingdom, but as a vassal state. He demanded Scottish soldiers for his wars in France and insisted that all legal appeals from Scotland be heard in English courts. For the proud Scottish lords, this was an unbearable insult. For the common people, it meant heavy taxes and foreign rule. The air grew thick with resentment. Rebellion was no longer a matter of if, but when. And from the ranks of the lesser nobility, a man emerged who was not a king, not a great lord, but a knight with an unshakable will. A man named William Wallace. He was not born to lead a nation, but in the crucible of Edward's tyranny, he would be forged into its sword and its shield. He was about to step onto a stage set for bloodshed, and change the course of history forever. The rebellion began not with a grand army, but with fire and blood. In May of 1297, William Wallace, incensed by the English occupation and, according to legend, the murder of his wife, led a raid on the English-held town of Lanark. He killed the English sheriff, William Heselrigg, and butchered the garrison. The act was pure, savage vengeance. It was also a spark in a tinderbox. Across Scotland, commoners and knights, long simmering with hatred for Edward's rule, rose up. Wallace had given their anger a voice, and that voice was a battle cry. His legend was truly forged at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. In September 1297, a massive, confident English army advanced towards a small Scottish force led by Wallace and Andrew de Moray. The English had knights, heavy cavalry, and overwhelming numbers. Wallace had boggy ground and a narrow bridge. He waited. He watched as the English knights, arrogant and impatient, thundered across the bridge 2 by 2. When nearly half the English force was trapped on the northern bank, Wallace gave the signal. The Scots charged. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The narrow bridge became a fatal choke point. English knights, weighed down by their armor, were speared, hacked apart, or drowned in the river Forth. The Scots, fighting with pikes and raw fury, annihilated them. They say the Scots even flayed the skin from the English treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, and made trophy belts from it. Wallace had done the impossible. He had shattered the myth of English invincibility. For a brief, glorious moment, he was the guardian of Scotland, and the nation was free. But a king like Edward I does not forget such a humiliation. He was called the Hammer of the Scots for a reason. 1 year later, in July 1298, Edward himself marched north with a new, even larger army. This time, he brought his ultimate weapon, the English longbow. At the Battle of Falkirk, Wallace's tactics were sound. He arranged his spearmen in 4 massive, bristling hedgehog-like formations called schiltrons. They were impenetrable to cavalry. But Edward didn't charge. He halted his knights and unleashed a storm of arrows. The longbows were the machine guns of the medieval world. They fired faster, farther, and with more piercing power than gunpowder had come before. The sky went dark with shafts. The arrows rained down on the schiltrons, finding gaps in armor, piercing leather and flesh. The Scottish formations, unable to advance or retreat, were simply butchered from a distance. Thousands died without ever getting close to an English soldier. When the Scottish nobles on horseback saw the slaughter, many of them fled, abandoning Wallace and the infantry to their fate. Falkirk was a catastrophe. The rebellion was crushed. Wallace's army was gone. He resigned the guardianship and vanished into the shadows, becoming a fugitive. For 7 years, he was a ghost. A hunted man with a price on his head. He traveled to France and Rome, desperately seeking allies and support for Scotland's cause, but the great powers of Europe would not risk Edward's wrath. He returned to his homeland to wage a guerrilla war from the forests and hills, a phantom menace that the English could never quite catch. He was abandoned by many of the nobles who once supported him, but he never abandoned his cause. The end came not on a battlefield, but through betrayal. On August 3, 1305, near Glasgow, Wallace was captured. The man who handed him over was a Scottish knight, Sir John de Menteith. A fellow Scot, sworn to the same cause, sold him to the English for land and gold. Wallace was taken completely by surprise, asleep in a barn. He never had a chance to fight. His journey to London was a carefully staged spectacle of humiliation. He was stripped bare, his hands tied behind his back, and paraded through the English countryside for 15 days. In every town, he was put on public display, pelted with filth and garbage, a monster to be jeered at. This wasn't just a prisoner being transported, this was the breaking of a symbol. On August 23, 1305, he was brought to Westminster Hall for his trial. It was a farce. There was no jury, no defense. The verdict had been decided before he even entered the room. A crown of oak leaves was forced onto his head, a mockery of a royal crown. to signify he was the king of the outlaws. The charges were read: treason, murder, sacrilege, and atrocities against English civilians. When accused of treason, Wallace finally spoke. His words, recorded by those present, echo through the centuries. He declared, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." He admitted to the burning of towns and the killing of English soldiers. He was a soldier in a war for his country's freedom. But the judgment was swift and absolute. He was to be made an example. He was sentenced to suffer the full penalty for a traitor, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. What followed is the part Hollywood leaves out. He was tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame, and dragged by horses for 4 miles through the packed streets of London to Smithfield, the public execution site. The crowd screamed insults, threw feces and dead animals at him. Upon arrival, the true horror began. He was hanged from a gallows, but cut down while he was still conscious, gasping for air. Then, he was strapped to a wooden table. The executioner took a knife. In front of the roaring crowd, and in front of Wallace's own eyes, he was castrated. Then, the executioner sliced open his abdomen. He pulled out his intestines, yard by yard, and held them up to the crowd before throwing them into a waiting fire. William Wallace was forced to watch his own guts burn. Even through this unimaginable agony, English chronicles state that he refused to beg for mercy or renounce his cause. The only thing he was said to have done was keep his eyes fixed on a psalter, a book of psalms, that he had carried with him through all his campaigns. Only after the disembowelment did the executioner finally grant him the release of death. His heart was cut from his chest. Then, his head was severed from his body with an axe. The horror was still not over. His body was then hacked into 4 pieces. King Edward's final, brutal message had to be sent. Wallace's head, dipped in tar to preserve it, was impaled on a spike on London Bridge. His right arm was sent to Newcastle, a warning to the north. His left arm to Berwick. His right leg to Perth, and his left leg to Aberdeen. His body was scattered across the kingdoms, a gruesome testament to the price of defying the hammer of the Scots. Why? Why such a horrifying, elaborate, and public display of cruelty? To understand this, we have to look inside the mind of the man who ordered it, King Edward I. This wasn't simply an execution, it was a carefully crafted piece of political theater. Edward wasn't just killing a man, he was trying to kill an idea. The idea of a Scotland free from his rule. Edward I was obsessed with a singular vision, a unified Great Britain under his absolute control. He had already conquered Wales, brutally suppressing its culture and building a ring of massive stone castles to enforce his dominance. Scotland was the final piece of his imperial puzzle. When William Wallace, a man of no great noble birth, rose from obscurity to shatter his armies at Stirling Bridge, it was more than a military defeat. It was a profound, personal insult. In the rigid hierarchy of the medieval world, kings ruled by divine right. Nobles fought other nobles. Wallace, a mere knight, had upended this entire world order. He had inspired commoners to take up arms and slaughter their supposed social superiors. In Edward's eyes, this made Wallace not just an enemy to humanity, but a cancerous growth on the body of society, a monster who had to be excised in the most gruesome way imaginable, as a warning to any other commoner who dared to dream above their station. Every element of the execution was steeped in symbolic power, a legal and religious damnation. The sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was the prescribed punishment for high treason, and each step had a specific, terrifying meaning. First, being dragged on a hurdle through the streets stripped him of all dignity and status, treating him like filth before the punishment even began. The hanging, but being cut down while alive, was symbolic of the shame of a common criminal, denying him the honorable death of a knight, which would have been a simple beheading. The drawing, the disembowelment and castration, was the core of the horror. In medieval thought, the bowels were the seat of compassion and passion. By tearing them out and burning them before his eyes, the state was symbolically purging his treasonous thoughts and desires from the world. It was a violation of the most profound and intimate part of a person's physical being. The beheading came last, the standard punishment for a crime against the king. And finally, the quartering. This was the ultimate act of annihilation. By dismembering his body and sending the parts to the four corners of the kingdom, Edward was attempting to do two things. First, he was creating a terrifying, physical map of his power. A severed head on London Bridge and a rotting limb in Newcastle were undeniable statements. This is what happens when you defy me. My reach is everywhere. Second, and perhaps more importantly, he was attempting to deny Wallace a Christian burial. In an age of profound faith, the hope of salvation rested on being buried whole, awaiting the resurrection on Judgment Day. By scattering his remains, Edward was trying to condemn not just Wallace's body, but his very soul, to eternal damnation. This level of brutality was rarely applied, even to traitors. Captured Scottish nobles were usually ransomed or, if executed, granted a swift death. But Wallace was different. He hadn't just fought a war, he had inspired a revolution of the spirit. The hope he created had to be answered with an equal or greater measure of terror. The execution wasn't justice. It was psychological warfare. And this is why the Braveheart version, as powerful as it is, misses the point. It sanitizes the event to make Wallace a more palatable hero. But the real horror, the real truth, is that the execution was meant to be unbearable. By softening it, we risk forgetting the true nature of Edward's tyranny and the sheer, terrifying power that Wallace dared to confront. In the end, King Edward's masterfully choreographed act of terror was a catastrophic failure. His goal was to make William Wallace an object of fear and revulsion, to erase his name or forever associate it with the grisly fate of a traitor. He wanted to scatter his body so that he could never be whole again. But in doing so, he made Wallace eternal. The man was gone, but the martyr was born. The severed limbs, meant to be terrifying warnings, became holy relics in the eyes of the Scots. The head on London Bridge became not a symbol of English dominance, but a symbol of Scottish defiance. The story of his unimaginable suffering was retold in hushed whispers around firesides, growing more potent with every telling. It became the founding myth of a renewed struggle. Edward, in his clinical cruelty, had not created a monster, he had forged a national hero more powerful in death than he ever was in life. The proof of this is what happened next. Just 6 months after Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce, the nobleman who had once competed for the crown and even sided with Edward, staked his own claim. He murdered his rival, John Comyn, in a church and had himself crowned King of Scots. It was a desperate, almost suicidal gamble. But the nation was now ready. The horror of Wallace's death had galvanized the Scottish people with a righteous fury that no noble had been able to inspire before. It was Wallace's ghost, Wallace's sacrifice, that fueled the armies Robert the Bruce would lead to a stunning victory at the Battle of Bannockburn 9 years later, finally securing the independence Wallace had bled for. So why does this gruesome story from over 700 years ago still matter? Because it peels back the veneer of history and exposes a raw and timeless truth about power, cruelty, and memory. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How do we choose to remember our heroes? Do we prefer the comfortable, cinematic myth over the brutal, inconvenient reality? The story of William Wallace reveals that power, when threatened, rarely relies on justice. It relies on terror. It uses the spectacle of cruelty as a tool to control not just bodies, but narratives. But it also reveals the ultimate limitation of that power. Maybe the real horror isn't the hanging, the drawing, or the quartering. Maybe the real horror is how easily history can be twisted into a weapon. And how the stories we are told are often deliberately sanitized, robbing us of the terrifying, essential truths of the past. Edward I wanted to write the final chapter of William Wallace's story in blood and fear. He failed. The memory of Wallace outlived the king who killed him, and the empire that condemned him. It's a chilling reminder that you can kill a person, dismember their body, and scatter them to the winds, but you cannot always kill what they stand for.